Hello. I just wanted to do a version of my presentation that I made for the Practical Farmers of Iowa uh, conference and the Minnesota Organic Conference. So I can it's good to get all my ideas straight, and hopefully this makes sense. Um, so this first video will be about interseeding corn for organic weed control. Fresh Starts Farm is just outside of Mora, Minnesota. Certified organic. Um, Basically, this area used to be white pine forest until it was clear cut about 150 years ago. Um, and forests don't really grow soil like grasslands, so we have pretty um, thin soils. They're low organic matter. They're high silt content loam, and they drain very poorly. Um, and they're really high in magnesium, which adds to that uh, poor draining and compactability aspect. Um, so going into organic farming, just the traditional high rates of cultivation weren't very attractive. Had a lot of reason to want to regenerate the soil, and now I'm looking at 2.5 to 3.5% organic matter in my soil, and a lot of improved functioning. Can farm some of the low spots more now. Better water infiltration. So, and the soil aggregates are much more stable. So, how I did this was through the interseeding cover crops. Kind of how I came to this partly was through my what I guess agricultural education I did have. It was in biointensive farming. This guy is John Jevons, and he's one of the main practitioners of this. He's written some books. But basically, biointensive vegetable farming or market gardening uses tight, even plant spacing in your crop canopy to outcompete weeds. And then there's a strong utilization of companion planting and intercropping, and looking at how different plants can work together and complement each other. Vegetable farming seems to have much more of an idea about this than row crop farming, and it's been found that you can boost your productivity, your yields, and also the flavor of the vegetables you're growing with certain companion planting, and some crops are antagonistic towards each other too. They really don't like growing together. So that's one of the inspirations for this approach to organic row crop farming. So, typical reaction is that it looks like weeds. How are these plants that are growing with your cash crop not just subtracting nutrients and hurting your cash crop? This is just an extremely prevalent perspective. But I'm here to tell you that with some management, you can create a sacrificial companion cover crop, what I'd call a sacrificial companion cover crop, out of a quote-unquote weed that improves your soil and benefits your cash crop. So the basic things you have to accomplish to do this are to give your cash crop a head start. So I keep my cash crop weed free for about 2 weeks after planting with 10 weeders and rotary hose, whatnot. And then you have to interseed a beneficial species, one that works well with your cash crop, and that suppresses kind of the unwanted, the real weeds in your field, the ragweeds, the foxtails, the Palmer amaranth, what have you, all those plants we know can really hinder our cash crop. And then finally you have to inter-row crimp, mow it, or otherwise manage it ahead of your cash crop's maturation to release nutrients and feed your cash crop during grain fill, which is the time of greatest need for your cash crop. So you have to take some measure to kill that cover crop and to get those nutrients cycling back. That's how you can start out with something growing with your cash crop, have an effect like a cover crop on your soil, and then have it end up feeding your cash crop. So to get into this, we're trying to mimic the effect of a cover crop to build your soil. Well, how do cover crops build your soil? Why do we have to do something like this rather than just planting corn in 30-inch rows like we normally do? And the reason that cover crops build your soil is through the life and death of the microbes that they support in the soil. That is how you build organic matter and natural fertility, is through the microbes those plants essentially farm. So, basically how this works is your plant roots exude sugars that feed the microbes. And so that's how your cover crops grow the microbial mass. So the more roots you have in the soil and the more plants photosynthesizing above the soil, the more food you have for microbes. The more microbes you have, the more cycling of soil nutrients. Microbes have different skill sets in unlocking different nutrients from the soil, unlocking different chemical bonds that release minerals for your plants. And they collect those and trade them with the plants for those sugars. So that's why we want plant diversity as well, is for a diverse microbial population. So in other words, it's a big feedback loop where the more plants you have out there, the more microbes. The more microbe poop and dead microbes, the more plant food. So Susan Orgill has a great presentation on this, but okay, so we've built our soil organic matter with dead microbes and live microbes. Why is this interesting? These microbes are the biggest component of soil carbon. A lot of people talk about soil carbon and, oh my God, we want carbon in our soil. It's so useful. Okay, why is that? Well, basically, these microbes and their necromass can increase your cation exchange capacity. They can literally hold more nutrients. It increases like the surface area, you could say, of your soil to hold and release nutrients. And then in regards to nutrients, 1% increase in your soil organic carbon in the top 4 inches of soil has 1,080 kilograms of nitrogen, which is the same as pounds per acre, basically. 228 kilograms of phosphorus, 168 kilograms of sulfur. So just an incredible amount of nutrition held in the tiny little microbe bodies. Those microbes, are made of protein. And protein is made out of a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur amongst other things, carbon. Of course, not all of this is available at one time to your plants. You know, a small portion of it is cycling around, and if your plants have a big root system and good biological connection, they are increasingly able to tap into this. And then also your water holding capacity can go through the roof, especially on your lighter, sandier soils. 20 to 30% increase in water holding capacity with a 1% increase in soil organic carbon. So incredible motivation, especially for my poor soils, for regeneration. So I was very gung-ho about cover cropping and figuring out a way to regenerate my soil. So, another function of these interseeded cover crops is just to hold on to and release nutrients later in the year. Right now, me included, if you're applying fertility ahead of planting, or you're plowing down a cover crop, or you're crimping a cover crop, the mineralization of those amendments that you've added preceding are not very well lined up with your crops, your cash crops' top nutrient uptake, which is later in the year during grain fill. So our mineralization peaks and starts decreasing far before our cash crop does, and that's a problem because a lot of nutrients are leaky. They leach from the soil, they're water soluble, they gas off into the atmosphere. In the case of plant matter, that's just sitting above the ground. They can become chemically bound up in the soil, like sulfur or phosphorus. Very small percentage of that gets into your plants if it's soil applied, just because it binds up with other minerals in the soil and becomes unavailable. But these cover crops and the microbes they support are working hard to release those nutrients for themselves to take up and hold in a nice stable form called plant. And then when those cover crops are killed with your in-row crimping or your mowing or the crop canopy, sometimes in the case of corn and sunflowers, when that cover crop dies, then that's an opportunity for remineralization of all those amendments that your cover crop has stored for you, and mined more amendments from the soil with the help of biology. All of those nutrients are in plant form because they are a plant, and then they break down and they become plant available for your cash crop. The big caveat to this is that you need to be using low carbon to nitrogen ratio cover crops to get that remineralization to happen in the same year, and at the right time. If you have some very high carbon plant residue that you're crimping and smashing into the soil, it's going to take forever for it to break down. It's going to tie up other nutrients in the process. And so, you need a low carbon to nitrogen ratio plant material so that it breaks down extremely quickly, and is optimal bacteria and fungal food so they can quickly turn back into plant available nutrients. So that's basically how this is helping fertilize your cash crop and managing nutrients. Okay, so how I started down this path was basically in the effort to get cover crops in the rotation and regenerate soil. I started out with what's called CORT, cover crop based organic rotational no-till. Basically, you plant a cover crop the fall preceding, and then you no-till plant your corn or your beans into it, and you crimp the cover crop, and your cash crop grows up through the mat you've created, and hopefully that mat suppresses the weeds. Well, I have had a lot of difficulty with this, partly because I'm so far north, limited growing season, had to switch up my rotation to have small grains ahead of any corn or beans so I could get, a cover crop established the fall before. And then, even if you got your cover crop established nice and early, had some things that are just really out of my control, such as extreme deer predation that would thin back that cover crop, take out all the tillers during the winter. The deer would just, dig down and eat it. And then standing water in the spring from big, snow melt and rain. That standing water would kill the cover crop. Anyways, basically was facing a suboptimal cover crop that you can't no-till into the majority of years. So 2020, I decided, I was going to till in this cover crop. It wasn't thick enough, no-till into. So what are we going to do? Still want to do something regenerative. Okay, we'll give the corn a little bit of a head start, and then we'll take a seed drill in something behind it. A couple weeks later, that's weed suppressive. Let's try buckwheat. I had seen that in action on an organic farm as a, weed smothering cover crop. Let's give that a shot. And the picture there, you can see it worked really well. Corn was beautiful. If you walked into that corn canopy, the buckwheat was very well suppressed. It had lost its leaves and kind of fallen over a little bit and was all but dead. And the corn was beautiful. And it was that point on, I figured I was onto something. And yeah, this corn is planted twin row 30s, so narrow rows, and that canopy was the mechanism for killing that buckwheat. So, what makes buckwheat a good companion cover crop? Obviously, there's reasons it can grow well with corn and not be a terrible competitive force that kills your yield. Well, basically, buckwheat it has a little bit of allelopathy in that it prevents some weeds from germinating, I believe, but by and large, it's just brute force weed suppression. It grows quicker than everything else. You do want it to be germinating before any other weeds, of course, but if you accomplish that, then it's anything that germinates after the buckwheat's going to get totally swallowed up and shaded out by the buckwheat. It is not greedy with fertility. Really is evolved to thrive in extremely poor soils. You can plant buckwheat in miserable soil and it'll just look like really healthy and amazing. So it really doesn't know what to do with all that available nitrogen and fertility that you've put out there for your corn. Corn doesn't seem like it gets too much competition that way. That being said, it can lock up phosphorus. I haven't really had this problem, mostly just because I think if you give your corn a good head start, this isn't so much of a problem. But from what I hear, people that have had corn they planted into buckwheat fields, they had buckwheat in the year prior, and had volunteer buckwheat come up with the corn, it can cause phosphorus deficiencies. So something to think about. Maybe work on your phosphorus levels, have a strategy for addressing that. But the 2-week head start should be a big part of making that not an issue. And then buckwheat's a really good companion cover crop just because of the massive amount of soil biology that it stimulates. So there's a whole class of cover crops, basically termed tilth creating cover crops over in England. And tilth or soil aggregation is just the manifestation we can see with our eyes of soil biology. So just really improving the texture of your soil, the air infiltration, how it holds together, resists tillage essentially. All these things are just from stimulating soil biology aggressively, and buckwheat is one of those plants that does that. So that's a huge positive of buckwheat. And then finally, it's easily mechanically destroyed. Buckwheat is a poorly designed skyscraper. Basically, it's a tower. It's a hollow tower made up of water balloons. It can't grow super tall before it basically crimps itself. If you want to crimp it early, you can do so. You're going to smash and make it unable to translocate water and nutrients. So you can kill it very easily with a crimper. So kind of the details on how to be successful with this system for corn is, plant your corn, and then your typical organic practices kind of apply. Blind cultivation, rotary hoes, tine weeders, utilize those early and often to keep the corn weed free until V2. There's a picture of a curse buster. I like this machine for defeating hard pans, compaction layers, and then you can actually run it after planting if you're quite brave. But it works quite well actually, because the harrow on the back is perfect for right after planting, before anything's germinated, to just stir up the top inch or inch and a half of soil and really help prevent weeds from germinating. And it's nice and aggressive and kind of sets the stage for making the rotary hoe and tine weeder even more effective thereafter. Once the corn is germinated, you can use the tine weeder or rotary hoe. Tine weeder, you can only use that before the corn's out of the ground, basically. But part of this is to say that you want to mechanically get rid of your compaction to make these cover crops really work for you the most that they can. Some people are of the mindset that all tillage is bad and cover crops will accomplish all of that tillage. Well, in my experience, at least on my soils, you want to defeat your compaction layer with tillage and then plant your wonderful soil improving cover crops. And then you'll get the most out of them. It's the best of both worlds. And you'll have more soil improvement with the healthier, less restricted cover crop. And so after your last rotary hoe or tine weeder pass, you want to run your interseeder or your drill as soon as possible right afterwards. To give your cover crop the best jump on weeds as you can. I like drills because they're also a tillage device. They create these kind of micro ridges in the soil as you go on, and I think they're a good last pass through the field, kind of creating a terrain that's less suitable to weeds as well. And then the narrow row spacing is good for the coverage of those ridges and your cover crop. So I run a Case 5100 drill, just drive as best I can a few inches off center, and then I go right around the twin rows, and I get really good coverage of my cover crop across the whole field. Drill's definitely the most cost-effective way to get into this over, some sort of custom interseeding rig, though that would be nice. Basically, you just have to be careful about your drill design so that you can put minimal force on, or just the right amount of force to get your cover crop into moisture, into the ground, but not so much force that your disc openers are way in the ground blowing out soil and your packer wheels are just annihilating everything it runs over. It's good to have control over the downforce with the hydraulics like you do on a Case 5100 or 5400 or whatever. I just don't want a huge amount of force on the row units. Just enough. Let the wheels on the outside of the drill carry the weight, and just put the amount you want. And then I did wheel spacers on the drill tires to get them out spaced nicely in between the rows. So my recommendation here is to drill 70 to 100 pounds of buckwheat. There's a lot of variability on seed size. First couple years I had very small seeded buckwheat that was given to me when I bought buckwheat. And there you probably could have drilled 50, 60 pounds and gotten away with it, but you really want to be on the heavier side. Make sure you suppress the weeds. Worst thing is to not seed enough and have a bunch of weeds that aren't suppressed by your buckwheat and have to cultivate it all out. That's a big bummer. So go on the heavier side. I definitely recommend 80 pounds or more. And then we're still working on figuring out what else can grow with buckwheat, if anything. I think mustard can, but I'm hesitant to put a bunch of mustard out there because mustard likes fertility. And so I think it'd be competitive with the corn, I believe. Others have seen that. So I have tried peas, yellow peas, and cowpeas. And both have been very quickly swallowed up by the buckwheat and were not worth putting in the mix. Except if you are planning on crimping the buckwheat early. I'll go into that a little bit later. But if you're planning on crimping the buckwheat out early because of drought concerns about soaking up too much moisture with your buckwheat, you can crimp it early, kill the buckwheat, and then if you have something like cowpeas, nice legume that can survive the crimping and then come in later, that might be a great way to go. Cowpeas, can fix nitrogen. They're also very drought tolerant, have a huge taproot, and have been shown to be a good companion crop with corn. That would be a good way to go. Kind of nifty that you can crimp out the buckwheat and then basically have it be a relay into another cover crop that can survive a crimper. So, water conservation concerns, you're out west. I am in Minnesota, east central Minnesota. We get, I think, close to 30 inches of rainfall a year on average. That being said, we've had plenty of drought years in the last 5 years, like 4 years have been drought, basically. So with my crimping rig, being that it is a peasant's inter-row crimper, a very cool idea would be to take a high clearance sprayer and make it into a crimper, and then you could crimp the buckwheat when the corn is tall. That's the ideal, but of course, we're not all equipped with that. So you either have to crimp your buckwheat when you can still drive through the corn, or you need to strategize, plant narrow rows to use the canopy to suppress the buckwheat. But obviously there's a big chunk of time in between when the corn is too tall to drive through with your tractor and when it has killed the buckwheat with its canopy. So what you could do is crimp early, when the corn's maybe 3.5, 4 feet tall, to kill the buckwheat. You're just going to get minimal soil improvement, carbon sequestration, feeding of biology, smaller release of fertility. Everything's going to be minimized in that regard, but you could put something else in there to succeed it, like the cowpeas I was talking about. But yeah, it's basically the management technique you have is to crimp out, mow out, whatever this cover crop if you're facing a dry time. But like we were talking about with this aggressive cover cropping, and increasing our soil organic matter, we're really growing our metaphorical water tank in our soil. And so in the long run, we're making ourselves more drought resilient. That being said, it doesn't matter how big your tank is. If it doesn't get filled up at the beginning of the season, it's got limited carrying capacity for plants. So, but yeah, if you had a high clearance crimper rig, it eliminates that risk you'd have, that I have in this system where I'm relying on the corn canopy later in the season to suppress the buckwheat. You could just go out and at your own pleasure, destroy that cover crop, and get nutrient cycling and conserve a little bit of water. That being said, I would be hard pressed for a year to be too dry to at least plant the buckwheat. If you have to crimp it after 6 weeks, so be it. But by that time it's used very minimal water. It's protected your soil, and it's prevented a lot of heating and radiation on your soil, which is, it's probably helping conserve water up to the point that it's a few feet tall, I guess is what I'm saying. So yeah, this would be the ultimate tool, is some way to crimp your buckwheat when the corn is tall. We're looking at robotics these days, green field ag. That would be another way to crimp in between the corn rows. Also have drones. I bought one myself. It's going to be a game changer for foliar feeding. But, the rotor wash, it might just be enough to get that buckwheat falling over on itself and self-smothering. You just need to get it that skyscraper of water balloons tilting a little bit, and then it gets crimped and can't stand back up, and it just needs a little nudge. So these are methods that you could go in and on demand destroy your buckwheat, and you need this if you're doing 30-inch rows. You need some way, either crimping early before corn's too tall, or you need a high clearance rig or something if you're doing 30-inch rows. 30-inch rows will not shade out the buckwheat. Maybe way down the line and near the end of the season it will, but you want it to start shading out and freaking the buckwheat out, causing it to lose its leaves early. So if you're going to try and use the canopy to kill the buckwheat, you need narrow rows, twin rows, 20-inch rows, something like that. And that's, what I do, and there's some steps you can do to make this successful. Increases your chances for success. Or in addition to the narrow rows, use a medium to large stature corn. You don't want any short stuff. You want wide leaves, and more of a lateral leaf structure than upright if you can. Upright's all right, but it has to be a tall corn variety in that case. And then planting a little bit thick too, higher population. I've found, for me, kind of a good compromise between canopy closure and plant spacing is around 37,000 plants an acre on my twin rows. Then you can get a thick enough canopy, and then you just want to support your plants nutritionally as you would, in any other situation, so that you get nice big plants. That's how you suppress your cover crop. So this picture on the right here is, that's a beautiful picture, but the corn canopy isn't suppressing that buckwheat. This picture on the left is where the buckwheat has discovered it's going to be shaded out. It loses almost all of its leaves. It falls over, collapses. Some has been there, collapsed for a while and is dead. Some of it's newly collapsed. But as the buckwheat realizes it's not going to get enough sunlight, it loses its leaves progressively and falls over. This is a really good slow release of nutrients. The leaves drop on the ground. They're under the cover of plants. There's huge amount of worms going on. That's the macro manifestation of soil biology. These succulent buckwheat leaves are just instantly decomposed or are pulled into the soil by earthworms. See that quite often, where they don't quite get the leaf all the way into the soil. Kind of looks like an inverted umbrella, partway submerged in soil. And it's like, how did that get there? Well, earthworm was tugging on it and just couldn't quite get it in. So picture on the left is more like what you want to see. That corn did lose a couple of its lower leaves, though, because the buckwheat was tall enough for a while. So ideally, you do want it to start dying off like this even earlier so that your corn doesn't kind of get stressed for light on its lower leaves very much. So yeah, this picture is really more like what you want to see. Nice tall corn, fairly dense canopy. It shades out the buckwheat and obviously is got a good nutrition going on. Here's a picture of that buckwheat. It looks like snake grass. I did not pull off these leaves, just it's lost them. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So here is a slide from Biomineral Technologies. They have a presentation on growing high-yielding corn. And this great graph of the nutrient demands over time. I added a few lines, I'm sure you can tell. But basically, this is just me mapping out kind of the effect of two different scenarios. The yellow or green see-through line is, a crimping scenario where you have to crimp before the corn gets too tall and your release of nutrients is smaller, compared with the black line where you are using the corn canopy to suppress the buckwheat. The buckwheat dies much later in the season, much longer release of nutrients, and it happens later in the year, and it lines up very well with the grain fill period. As you can see, during the grain fill period, it needs all of the nutrients in good supply, and so that's why you want a decomposing cover crop feeding your corn crop at that time. And then you can kind of see the space in between these two humps. That's, when the corn is too tall, I don't have a high clearance inter-row crimper. That's, the time period you have to get this field through with, fairly decent water demands. I have gone through droughts doing this method, and the water demand is higher, but it's not double or anything. My corn got water stressed, a few days before my neighbors. But I guess that's just another thing you can look at on this graph, is this period where you would have a larger nutrient release and a later crimping if you did it somewhere in between those two scenarios. All right, and now on to soybeans. So this was, inspired by the corn and buckwheat interseed. A couple years ago, after struggling with crimped rye, no-till organic soybeans, it's like, well, let's try and figure out a cover crop we can plant with soybeans, interseed it, 2 weeks after planting like corn. Let's try mustard. And this has worked extremely well. And in combination with this really cheap homemade inter-row crimper, you can have a lot of success with this. Yeah, it's been an exciting system. So why mustard? It's extremely strong allelopathic effect, weed suppressing effect. The mustard flavor chemical glucosinolate is, I believe, the chemical the mustard uses to basically signals once it's out of the ground for other things not to germinate. So if you give a good coverage of mustard growing, you're not going to have any weeds germinating, basically. The mustard matures extremely quickly in the summer heat, so you're planting it a couple weeks after soybeans. For me, that means June. Um, its signal to start flowering is heat units, and it accrues those very quickly, obviously. So it just blasts to flowering as quickly as possible, and that means you can crimp it earlier. Once it flowers, then that's your opportunity to smash it, and it will give up on trying to come back. So it gets to that stage very quickly, and so it lines up well with the beans, where it doesn't spend a whole lot of time vegetative trying to shade out the beans. It gets to flowering very quickly, and you can get it to senesce very early. It does like fertility, but the feeding aspect's not a huge problem with beans, because beans produce their own nitrogen. But that aspect is good for nutrient release later in the season. They accumulate a lot of sulfur, amongst other things, and beans need a ton of sulfur all at the end of the season. And sulfur is another one of those very reactive, leaky nutrients that we want to hold on to. And then it's a low carbon to nitrogen ratio its whole life. The mustard, meaning it breaks down very quickly after you crimp it. So that's very useful. And probably the most important thing about mustard, aside from its extreme weed suppressing behavior, is its extreme soil flocculation effect in the top few inches of the soil. It really aggressively stimulates biology, to the point that your top few inches of soil is very loose. Never mind a soil probe, you can just stick your finger into the ground near mustard plants. And for me, that is huge. I'm used to having concrete out in my fields after, doing a row cultivation of soybeans. It's just very not conducive to air infiltration, which is where your soybeans get all of their nitrogen from. So it's a very synergistic effect there. Getting air into your soil, that's extremely useful for your soybeans. And then finally, it also helps support pollinators, which are shown to help your bean yields via better pollination. So, one other thing I want to talk about is how soybeans are, they have effect on our soils, and it's not positive. I mean, farmers that have grown monocrops of soybeans know that, well, if you think that your soil looks a little rough or depleted after soybeans, it's because it probably is. Studies have shown soybeans don't fix enough nitrogen to meet their needs, especially during grain fill, and so they are obtaining that nitrogen as well as carbon and other nutrients from the soil. They are feeding off of the pool of live and dead bacteria through some mechanism or the other. They are dipping their grubby little hands into the cookie jar of microbiology, and they're not replacing what they take. So that's where you get the downward trajectory of your organic matter is. They're just not adding to the microbiology near as much as they're taking from it. So with the mustard, you are charging up your soil biology prior to the soybeans drying down from it. So that's one way we can minimize that impact. It makes a lot of sense that soybeans are feeding off of microbiology, because microbiology is made of protein, and as we know from I guess bodybuilders and the like, if you want to pack on protein, which soybeans, that's what they want to do when they're during grain fill. The best thing to do is eat protein or something very close to protein, like amino acids. We're pumping up your underground beef herd and getting those protein levels up for your soybeans to feed on. So that could potentially, increase your yields. I have no idea. Haven't done side-by-side trials. I can say just from the weed control standpoint, I believe my yields have increased. This is the cleanest fields of soybeans I've ever had. We're boosting the beans' food source before they start feeding, so that's a definitely upside from a agronomic perspective. And then through the increased air infiltration into the soil from the flocculation, the biological flocculation of the soil, with the mustard, just saw some really great nodule development on my soybean plants. A lot of nodules out on the lateral roots. This looks just great for my soybeans, and I don't know what other people's roots look like, but so these nodules must be a good thing. I don't know if, again, if they're boosting my yields or by how much. I would assume they are. Just getting that air into the soil is so huge for your beans. And then just to talk more about, your cash crops nutrient demands. They all really pile up at the end of the season. If you can kind of see from these graphs, there's these big chunks that happen in the end of the season. That's your grain fill. So we need to try and invert what we're doing from a nutrient management point, where we're just front loading all these nutrients that leak and get tied up over the course of the season, and then at the end of the season, when your cash crop has its biggest demands, that's when it's been the most time since the peak of the mineralization of those applications. So it's just to drive home that these cover crops growing with your cash crop are going to feed your cash crop at the most pivotal time, which is grain fill. You just need to use something that matures quick enough and that you can kill at the right time, and that decomposes quickly because of low carbon to nitrogen ratio. And then you can effectively create a sacrificial companion cover crop out of a weed. So some steps to success, if you will, with the mustard. There is a wider planting window than the corn with buckwheat. There you're really targeting V2. In soybeans, you can go earlier and later. Cotyledon to V2, which is longer than 2 weeks for soybeans. But it's just a matter of controlling the mustard when it starts to pass up the beans and shade them out and stress them. You're just gonna have to do that earlier if you plant at cotyledon. I think ideally you want to interseed soybeans that are V2 or V1, working on V2. This allows them to kind of stay the dominant force in your field, if you will. They won't, if you plant more around V2, the mustard will get to more equal with your soybeans by the time you want to be crimping it, as opposed to if you plant cotyledon, mustard's gonna pass up the soybeans a little bit. But yeah, you just have to get out there and crimp it and give the sunlight back to the beans. I planted 17 pounds an acre plus a pound or two of Phacelia. Plan on trying to add some flax to the mix next year because that's another soil building, biology stimulating plant. I would suggest you want to stay here or have more plants, just have that good coverage of the soil and good weed suppression. When you're crimping, crimping is a lot less important to be precise with than cultivating. You can miss some stuff. The mustard, once it flowers, it starts losing its top leaves, and in that way it allows more sunlight to your beans. And so if you have a few mustards you don't hit, that's fine. I was able to harvest about a bushel of mustard an acre off the stuff that I didn't hit with the crimper, and turning the fan down on my combine saved some seed for next year. And then the mustard variety, I'd recommend a white mustard. I used white gold from Green Cover Seed. It's a shorter variety, but it also has a higher glucosinolate level. It's better at weed suppression than maybe a yellow or a brown mustard. Yeah, I guess if you don't have an inter-row crimper, you could maybe use a weed zapper or a row mow, which is a lot more complex and expensive than a crimper, but and finally I also grow sunflowers with interseeded cover crops, and basically I treat these just like corn. Interseed buckwheat, looking at adding sun hemp this year. And then but you don't have to worry about inter-row crimping sunflowers. They're a very drought-tolerant crop, and they're extremely good at shading out competition. So you can just plant them a little thick, and they'll shade out your interseeded cover crop just fine. And you could maybe throw in some mustard because sunflowers are, require less fertility than corn if you need better weed control, but definitely more flexible there. Yeah, sunflowers are great. Thank you. Here's some contact information, and hopefully you're already on my YouTube channel. So, all right.